Thank you. Thanks for coming. And I believe you can hear me. I'm wired up twice, so who knows what will happen. So I will give you a very broad overview of how thinking about Soviet history has changed after 1991, after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, which is connected to a book I had hoped I would be able to bring at least as show and tell, but it's not out yet, so production took longer than hoped, so that will come up. I will spend a little bit more time on the revolutionary period because that is what many of you teach, but I will not stay there. There is an entire lecture on the Russian Revolution I did last year, which is a link to that lecture to a recording is on my website, which is easy to remember because it's just my name. So here's the outline. So I'll talk a little bit about what the major shift really is in terms of thinking about the significance of the Soviet Union after it imploded. That's where I begin. I'll talk about three reactions to 1991, and then how we might reconfigure the history of the Soviet Union. I'll talk a little bit about major themes I develop in this book and a chronology which I created in order to compress things, because my brief was to write a short book, a book which can be used in the 21st century classroom rather than the really big books which are basically no longer useful in the university classroom, in the undergraduate classroom today. And then I'll spend a little bit of time on the revolutionary period, the upheaval, the breakdown of the old empire and the reconstruction of the new one, and then walk fairly quickly through the 30s and the Second World War, and spend a little bit of time in mature socialism, if you like, that is post-Stalinist society, before I talk a little bit about moving from the Soviet Union to Russia today, about imperial hangover and feeling sad about the disappearance of the Soviet Union. So before 1991, if we simplify quite massively, there were two major interpretive questions for historians of the Soviet Union. One was about origin and the other about destination. So the one big historiographical fights were about the Russian Revolution, whether or not it was a revolution or a coup, if it was legitimate or not legitimate, if it was, if somehow the Bolsheviks stole the empire from a democratic revolution. Did it have to happen? Was this the big course of history which led to the revolution, or was it just a bit of bad luck that Lenin took over? So what was at stake in that debate was really the legitimacy of an existing state and the legitimacy of this existing state's foundational myth, the myth that the Great October Revolution was a massive popular uprising which brought a proletarian dictatorship into power. So that was the one very political debate, and the other one was about destination, namely Stalinism. What happens after the revolution, of course, is that eventually we get to Stalinism, and by Stalinism very often this meant 2 years, 37, 38, right? The Great Terror, it meant the Gulag. For detractors, it never meant the Second World War, which is interesting because that's, of course, they won. But that Stalinism was a problem for anybody who embraced the Soviet Union as a positive project, because you end up very few people. There are some, but very few people would have embraced Stalinism without reservations. So the question then becomes, was that inevitable? Did Stalinism have to happen, or was that a little bit of bad luck, right? So that was the other big question also what happens after. Is this the essence of the Soviet Union, Stalinism? Or is this a phase, and now, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we're in a very different phase of socialism. So that was about the essence of Bolshevism. Is Stalinism the real socialism, or is it some sort of aberration? And that drove a lot of the anger and the emotions in this debate. Now, we still have a little bit, the ghosts of these debates are still around. And of course, some of the historians who were very strongly engaged with some of my colleagues are also still around. But we face a very different situation. We no longer, after 1991, this is no longer a history of an existing state. This is no longer a history of an alternative to liberal capitalism, which is actually alive and well, but it is now the prehistory of 15 states, and that causes some trouble. But it also reconfigures what we need to think about there. So there's three reactions, I think, to this new situation, how to deal with this. Other than, one reaction which I'm actually ignoring because I think it's so silly, is to just say, we won. And this shows that history is at an end, and nothing will happen thereafter, and this was all a terrible mistake. But one reaction to this new situation of what you do with the Soviet Union is you dissolve it, if you like, right? You no longer write the history of the Soviet Union, but you write the history of 15 successor states. And I just put a few examples there, very good examples, I think, of histories of individual states, where the history of the Soviet Union becomes part of a prehistory of the post-1991 nation. This one here is the official Ukrainian history from the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, extremely good political history of Ukraine, but it basically tries to do that, rescue the history of Ukraine from the history of the Soviet Union. There's another reaction which is a little bit frightening, and that is largely existent in the Soviet Union. I'll show you a little YouTube video which has gone absolutely viral, which is saying, yes, the Soviet Union was an empire, and yes, that was a good thing. If it works. It does.
Здравствуйте. Я русский оккупант. Это моя профессия. Так сложилось исторически. Когда-то я оккупировал Сибирь. Теперь там добывают нефть, газ, алюминий и еще много полезного. Теперь там города с детскими садами и больницами. Теперь там нельзя продавать женщин за вязанку соболиных шкурок, как это было до русских. Я оккупировал Прибалтику. Ее хутора я застроил заводами и электростанциями. Прибалтика делала высококлассную радиотехнику и автомобили, славилась духами и бальзамами. Меня попросили оттуда уйти. Теперь там добывают шпроты, а часть населения чистит унитазы в Европе. Я оккупировал Среднюю Азию. В голых степях я построил каналы, заводы, космодромы, больницы и стадионы. Там строили космические ракеты и самолеты, развивали промышленность, выращивали пшеницу и хлопок для всей страны. Меня попросили оттуда уйти. Теперь там развивают американские кредиты и выращивают коноплю. А часть населения уехала работать на стройки бывших оккупантов. Я оккупировал Украину. Вместе с украинцами я строил авиадвигатели, корабли, танки и автомобили. Меня попросили оттуда уйти. Теперь там разрушают все, что осталось от оккупанта. При этом там не строят ничего нового, кроме бесконечных майданов и диктатуры. Да, я оккупант, и я устал извиняться за это. Я оккупант по праву рождения. Я агрессор и кровожадный урод. Бойтесь. Это я терпел зверства польских интервентов во времена смуты. Но чем закончилась их интервенция? Это я сжег Москву, чтобы не отдать ее Наполеону. Но как закончил Наполеон? Это я сидел в окопе у Волоколамска, понимая, что нацистов удержать не получится. Где теперь те нацисты? Где их проклятый Гитлер? Ко мне домой приходили все, кому не лень. Турки, англичане, поляки, немцы, французы. Земли хватило на всех. По 2,5 метра на каждого. Поймите, мне не нужна ваша лицемерная свобода. Мне не нужна ваша гнилая демократия. Мне чуждо все, что вы называете западными ценностями. У меня другие интересы. Вежливо предупреждаю в последний раз. Не нарывайтесь. Я строю мир. Я люблю мир. Но воевать я умею лучше всех. С уважением, русский оккупант.
And you see, this is actually already fairly old, right? Because he sent this to Obama. Do I want to close all tabs? Yeah, probably. So this is a reaction which you can see is largely interesting to Russians, right? Of course not all Russians, but this is a popular kind of reaction to which in a more sophisticated version is embraced by the current government. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin has famously said that 1991 was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, the breakdown of the Soviet Union. Another reaction was, and that's really the one I'm picking up on, is to think about the Soviet Union not as part of the history of Russia, but as a history of an empire, of a multinational empire. This historiography goes back actually to at least to the Second World War, but a real landmark was Richard Pipes's The Formation of the Soviet Union in 1954. And Ron Suney's The Revenge of the Past in 1993 started a whole new wave of that kind of literature on nationalities, nation building, and the empire. Of these major books, only two are really covering the entire Soviet experience. This one here is out of print, unfortunately, because I thought it was really very good. And this one is not, but it's actually also dated. It has been reissued in 2011, but with basically no changes. So this is basically a 1998 publication. Both of them are extremely fat. So they've been written to be used in a college classroom where the students read nothing else. And with today's, the amount of resources, primary sources and so on, in English translation, many of them, we now have access to online. And if you are interested in this, on my website, there's a tab to sources, which gives you a whole long list of online things. This no longer makes very much sense. You need a smaller book. And so that was what led to this. So I was trying to not write a history of the tragedy of how tragic it was that Russia lost its empire, as in this video clip we saw, but I tried to bring together this literature of the kind of the dissolution of the empire, the multiplicity of histories, and the idea of thinking about this as an empire, a multinational empire, in a short book which was supposed to be out in June, but is not, as you can see. There's three themes I'm dealing with in this book. One is Soviet Union as a warfare state. So this is a state which emerges from World War I, from an incredibly nasty civil war, and which originally is basically built to win a war. That's what the Soviet Union originally was built to do. And it's a state which is run by people who expect more war. They think the essence of capitalism is war. It always leads to war, and we need to be prepared for this. And that leads to the Stalin Revolution. That leads to this very brutal mobilizational regime of the 30s. Is intended to get the country ready for the next war. And I'll quote Comrade Stalin on this a little bit later. But that was not all. I mean, for the 30s, for the Civil War years, the Civil War years and then the 30s, you could tell the story as just one of a warfare state. But this is also a state which is run by Marxists who don't want to build a warfare state. They're not fascists, right? They want to build socialism or communism. which in the end then meant that they built some version of a welfare state. One which looked after the population, where your job was fairly guaranteed, where housing would be provided, where healthcare would be provided, and so on. And I'll talk a little bit about this later. That is really, and the big story I'm telling, I think, is one of a shift from the warfare state to the welfare state. So you get the Soviets after Second World War slowly, and then after Stalin's death fairly quickly, moving away from only investing in things which have to do with defense and invest in houses instead. And this is unfortunately very dark, but what holds the multiplicity of these national histories which develop under the framework of the Soviet Union together is empire. This is the chronology I'm using, and as I said, I will spend a little bit more time today on this first age of violence, and I will basically not talk about part 5, but if you like, we can use the discussion for this. So the first age of violence begins really with a major war against Japan, which goes terribly wrong, goes poorly, and triggers the first revolution. And in many ways, that is a whole decade of crisis before World War I comes onto the scene and then really exacerbates the crisis quite massively. So in the late 19th century, or the mid-19th century actually, and the early 20th century, this empire, which was one of the arguably the most successful empire, certainly the most successful land empire since the Mongols, is in crisis. This was the biggest country in Europe, in the world, in fact. It still is. Even the shortened, the abbreviated Russia of today is still the largest state in the world. It had been built with very poor material and human resources. This is not a highly educated society. This is not one with a lot of resources, and it's one which is absolutely prone to invasion because there are no natural boundaries. So they were surrounded by aggressive neighbors, and they dealt with this by basically creating an early version of a warfare state where everything is geared towards expansion and war. So the economic basis of this is serfdom, and then the political basis of this is that the non-serf elites are harnessed to work for the state and are absolutely reliant on the Tsar in their everyday lives. This runs into this was very successful, right? But runs into terrible trouble in the 19th century because they're now facing competitors who have overseas empires and who have industrialization and have national armies very often. So the dual revolution, so the innovation of the French Revolution, the political revolution coming out of France and the industrial revolution coming out of Britain really changed this, and it becomes very clear that the Tsarist empire cannot compete with these new competitors, and something needs to be done. But when they then try to do something about it, abolition of serfdom, military reform, industrialization, that only exacerbates the problems because now they get a more educated population. They get a peasantry who wants more land. They get an intelligentsia who is unhappy with the lack of civil liberties, and so on and so on and so on. They get a very highly concentrated, very quickly, very militant working class. So instead of solving the problems, they multiply them, and that is basically the moment at which they then go to war again, World War I, after the first big crisis in 1904-5-6, has been smoothed over with some concessions, but the real issues are not solved by the time they go to war. The war just increases all of these problems. It leads to an incredible economic boom, but that economic boom leads to incredible social dislocation. It leads to, as you see here this shows you the circulation of money, unbelievable inflation. The war goes very poorly, and the Germans and the Austrians occupy much of here, first this, and then after things don't improve after Brest-Litovsk, they go before Brest-Litovsk, they go take all of Ukraine and the Baltics, Poland. This leads to massive, on the one hand, deportations, on the other hand, flights. So you have all these people from these former Russian areas coming and have to be dealt with. So you have an incredible crisis, politically, economically, socially. And that's basically when the revolution breaks out. The Russian Revolution here is in quotation marks because while it begins in Russian areas, that is in Petrograd, right, in the capital, and the two revolutions we usually think about when we think about the Russian Revolution is the February Revolution and the October Revolution, which happened in Petrograd. But that is only the epicenter of an empire-wide revolutionary crisis, where in addition to these urban revolutions, you have rural revolutions, people taking over land, sometimes killing the landlords, but very often just taking over the land. You have, and these play out in very different ways in different parts, right? I just put two extreme examples up here. In Central Asia, this is what the rural revolution looks like, right? And in Finland, which of course also is part of the Russian Empire, this is what the rural revolution looks like. These are the reds, and these are the rural whites. The reds are working class from the cities, and they are in the most brutal civil war at the time in Finland, the most lethal civil war in percentage terms of the population. So you have not one revolution, but a whole cluster of revolutions, and they implode this empire. Now, to give my students some orientation in all of this chaos, we can talk about the Russian side of the Civil War, and that is basically the Bolshevik side. That's the story of Bolshevik victory in the Russian heartland, which is basically what they end up having for quite some time before they reconquer the other areas. And that civil war you can remember by sort of more or less by year. You see when you look at the dates that it's not always exactly a year, but basically 1917 is the year of Bolshevik victory. 1918 is the year of disintegration of the empire. 1919 is the war against other Russian governments, that is the whites. And this is the year when much of the empire is being regathered by the Red Army, by military force. And then 1920 there are several things going on. On the one hand, there's a major war with one of the other successor states of the Russian Empire, that is Poland, where they, of course, in the end lose, and that stops further expansion to the west. But they also take back the Transcaucasus, and there's massive social upheaval and uprisings in internally the democracy, that is revolutionary peasants and revolutionary soldiers who stage anti-Bolshevik uprisings. But that's really only one part of the Civil War. Then you have all these others. I talked about this, the Finnish War. The Baltics is an incredibly convoluted and bloodthirsty story. Central Asia, the Civil War actually begins before the October Revolution. It begins with a major uprising in 1916 against conscription, and it goes until at least 23 in many places it drags on to 31. So this is a whole separate civil war, which is quite a colonial civil war between Slavic settlers and non-Slavic local populations. Ukraine, again, a very convoluted story with many more players than just the Reds and the Whites. And then, of course, in Ukraine in particular, but in other places too, Jews face a whole different situation of very massive anti-Jewish violence. And then there's another, I mean, the history of the Transcaucasus as well. So you see how this becomes actually very hard to tell as a coherent story if you're no longer just telling the history of Russia in the Civil War, that is, the Bolsheviks, right? But you try to tell the history of the Russian Empire in Civil War, it becomes very hard to tell this as a linear story. And now my clicker no longer, yeah, here. Another way to make sense of this whole chaos is to think about the national revolutions in three categories. One is countries which come out of all of this as independent states. So that's true for the Baltic states. That's true for Finland and Poland. The Baltic states, of course, only remain independent until World War II, when they get reconquered by the Soviets. And then there's the largest category, the third category of countries which are independent for a little while, but then get reconquered by the Red Army. So that's true for Ukraine, Belarus, the various white territories which claim to be Russian states and then lose out. It's true for Central Asia, and that's true for the various places of the Transcaucasus. How am I doing for time? So what you have at the end of this complex and very violent process, which is really much more than the Russian Revolution, right? It's war, imperial breakdown, imperial reconstruction. You get nearly the same borders, minus Finland, minus Poland, minus the Baltic states. But other than that, they end up with pretty much the same country, the Bolsheviks. And that's interesting, right? Because they're, of course, internationalists, but in practice, they turn out to be imperialists. So how do we explain that? And I have a whole separate argument about this, which I'll sideline here. But what is the major difference of this country, other than that, of course, there's no capitalists, it's socialist and so on, but as an empire, the major difference is that within the empire, there's now national territories. That didn't exist before. It exists in Finland. It existed for some while in Poland. But now, because they're trying to accommodate these new nationalist movements which came up in the Civil War, the way to deal with them is with a fake federalism. You say, okay, Ukrainians, you can be nationalists, you can have Ukraine, you can have Ukrainian culture, you're an independent state which is just in a union with us, and you can actually secede. They have the formal right to secede, right? Which is, of course, a complete fiction. But that has very long-time consequences, as this great historian Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin complains. Because it is that's how the Soviet Union breaks apart in 1991. Once the center is weakened, once the ideology which holds together this country is defunct, once the Communist Party is gone to hold it all together, it breaks apart into these national states. And in some places, national states where probably there wouldn't have been one otherwise. Belarus, it's very unlikely that there would have been a Belarusian nation if the Soviets would not have created Belarus and promoted Belarusian language and culture, which barely anybody spoke in Belarus, right? That's not always the case. I mean, it's quite different in Ukraine, for example. But so this period is absolutely essential for today, for the kind of situation we're facing after 1991, because by and large, with some exceptions and some details which change, but by and large, this is where these new countries take shape, which then become independent in 1991. Okay, so that was, I'm jumping over the interwar years, which I tell pretty much as a period of consolidation of the empire, which has been regathered, and I go to the to the what I call the second age of violence, which includes the 1930s, so pre-war Stalinism, and World War II. In terms of empire building, on the one hand, what's of course very important is industrialization, the creation of a very powerful Red Army, and so on, but also nationality policies which are fundamentally contradictory. And that goes back again to the situation where Marxists are dealing with very strong national movements around them. Because to Marxists, of course, national movements shouldn't exist. They're false consciousness. They're just, nationalism shouldn't really, once you understand your class position, you shouldn't need nationalism. But nevertheless, they confronted these very strong national movements. And the way to deal with that was to make concessions. So one concession were these national territories, but another concession is to give affirmative action on national grounds. So if you're a minority population, you get better access to higher education. You can educate your children in schools in your national language, and so on, so on, so on. So this is one part of this. So this is what Terry Martin has described as the affirmative action empire. This was particularly strong. Part of this is also an imperial strategy, namely for national minorities in the borderland regions. So let's say Poles in Ukraine or Koreans in the Far East, giving them special privileges. The idea is you show the population on the other side how good it would be to live under the Soviets, and then they will come to you by themselves. You don't even have to export the revolution because nobody will be afraid of the revolution. But then once the danger of real war becomes more and more acute, this same logic shifts in the mind of the leadership, in particular in the mind of Stalin, the most suspicious of them all, but he's not alone in this. And so what they had seen as potential wedges into, let's say, Poland, now they see as potential fifth columnists. So there's all these Poles in Ukraine who actually have a fairly strong national consciousness because there were affirmative action for Poles, there was education in Polish, there was, culture in the Polish language, and so on. That looks very suspicious suddenly. There's all these nationally conscious Poles, and on the other side of the border is Pilsudski. And Poland is a real threat, at least in the imagination of the Soviets for a very long time, until Hitler comes along. And so what do you do with these people? Well, you deport them. So the same logic then shifts to deportation, ethnic cleansing, and in fact, killing operations in the Great Terror, which are national. So there's national operations where they go after the elites in particular of minority populations. The other big story of the 30s is, all of this is in anticipation of war, right? You want these populations away from the border because there will be war. And then they will fight on the other side, or will shoot you in the back, and so on. But the other thing, of course, what you need to do if you prepare for war is you need to have a strong army. And last time, World War I, and even in 1945, you saw what happens if you don't have a strong army and have no modern army. And that means massive industrialization, and that means building up the Red Army. And that's the other big story of the 1930s. And here's a very famous Stalin quotation where he basically makes the point, we're in the same situation as the Tsarist Empire. We need to learn from history, comrades, right? Last time we were beaten, and we were beaten again and again. Beaten by the Poles, by, the Germans, by everybody. Everybody beat us because we're backward, and we will stop this because we will not be beaten again. And hence, cost it what it may, we will have industrialization and we'll have a strong country. And that's basically, he's reformulating the dilemma of the Russian Empire, and he's also reformulating in many ways a modern version of the way the Tsarist Empire had dealt with this problem, and that is a new service class of committed communists who are better educated, but who can also, parachute jump and shoot and do all of these things, read a map in case of war. And you harness everybody, but now with modern mass communications, with modern policing and so on. So it's in many ways, it's an updated version also, not just of the country they had taken over, but also of the kind of warfare state, only now a communist warfare state. And then war, of course, comes. The war we usually think about is what I have here as the second and third, the third and fourth phase. That is the war against Germany, this war here. Glory to the Red Army. The defensive war, the Great Patriotic War, which begins in the summer of 1922. If you look at the Second World War from Europe, of course, the war begins in 1939, right? 1st of September when the Germans go into Poland. But if you look at it from Asia, it begins in 1937. So when war breaks out in earnest breaks out between Japan and China, that war goes on the entire time, right? That is before the war happens in Europe. So for Chinese and Japanese, World War II really begins in 1937. And the Soviets are engaged in this war from the beginning. So they fight a defensive war in the East. Partially they do this by proxy, by supporting the Chinese government, sending weapons, sending military advisors, sending airmen. Some Soviets die there fighting. But they also fight two actual big battles, which are often forgotten. Undeclared border war with Japan, Lake Khasan and Khalkhin Gol, 38 and 39, which are absolutely essential for the history of the Second World War because they convince Tokyo that it's too hard to attack the Soviets. So the plans to attack the Soviet Union get shelved, and instead they go south, they go into the Pacific, they get into conflict with the United States, Pearl Harbor, which brings the United States. And so you see how everything, without this defensive war, this is probably Stalin's biggest international foreign political success because he keeps the Soviet Union out of a two-front war, which would have been very hard to fight in the Far East against Japan and in the West against Germany. Instead, they're neutral the entire time until the attack in August 1945. So they're neutral in the war in the Pacific, right, which is an interesting situation. So this is the defensive phase. Then there's, of course, an offensive phase in Europe when, under the shield of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, they take over parts of Poland. They fight a relatively unsuccessful but victorious war against Finland, and they take over the Baltic states. And then comes the phase where really most Soviets die, and where the biggest suffering happens in these two phases. And then the war drags on, actually, in particular in the western borderlands, well into the 40s. They're fighting a very, very sustained war against local partisans and insurgents. But once the war is over, the thing they have always prepared for, we get into a phase of consolidation and sort of pacification, civilization, if you like, of this warfare state. That begins already under Stalin, but he is quite an old and very stubborn man at that point, and he's not learning very many new tricks late in his life. But under the surface, there's a lot of thought about what needs to be changed, and that is the reason why in 1953 you get nearly immediate change. When Stalin is dead, you get reforms everywhere. And you get the building of some kind of a welfare state. This welfare state looks pretty defunct to us. So these buildings, which you can still encounter everywhere in the former Soviet Union, the Khrushchev buildings, which soon were known as Khrushchev slums because they were built very shabbily, very quickly, but there were an immense change. People moved out of communal apartments, moved out of barracks, moved sometimes out of tents, and moved into single-family occupancy rooms, small apartments which had their own kitchen, their own bathroom, and their own toilet. You no longer had to share all of these with your terrible neighbors. So that was a major shift and a major success of this very centralized welfare state. This is one expression of sort of overall rise of consumerism. And I want to show you another little snippet of a video, which one of the less important revolutionary projects of the Bolsheviks originally was liberation of women from patriarchal oppression and housework. Now, this was meant to sort of happen more or less automatically once you get towards communism, but it was a real aggressive kind of feminism. It didn't go very well, and in the 30s that gets reversed. But they still have things like International Women's Day as a holiday, right? By the 60s, this is what you do on International Women's Day. This is a piece from a wonderful website you might want to look at some point called 17 Moments in Soviet History, which is an online textbook put together by Louis Siegelbaum. And it has, among other things, wonderful videos on it. So I'll show you this one. So International Women's Day, and this is what you do on International Women's Day. You get a haircut, so you look better for your man. You get your nails done. Your husband, meanwhile, buys you flowers. Or other things which make you more beautiful. And he pays with hard-earned cash for this. So this is very much, that's quite a different society from the Stalinist one, but some things seem to never change, and that's lines. And that's because what doesn't change is the basic structure of the economy. The basic structure of the economy, which produces one thing, which is shortages in consumer goods. The things it's really good for, producing tanks, military equipment, flying people to the moon and so on, not to the moon, but into space. This is because there is real feedback mechanisms between the consumers of this hardware and the political leadership. So if they build a bad tank, they will learn very quickly. And people will get into real trouble. If they produce poor quality toilet paper, there's no feedback mechanism. Nobody will go to Comrade Stalin and say, this is really terrible, right? So that explains why certain things work really well in the Soviet Union, others don't. And then the whole way distribution is set up also leads to this. So this kind of welfare state constantly is working under a situation where there's constant lack of everything, and you spend, this is during working hours, of course, right? So you spend a lot of time standing in line. Very often this is the women doing this. There's the occasional man standing in line to just get stuff for daily life. So this is never this is a consumer society in a certain way, but never one where consumerism is easy. It's pretty hard. car ownership. There's a whole book by Louis Siegelbaum on car ownership, which, you know, by the 50s, 60s, 70s becomes by the 70s it's certainly a mass phenomenon. But it's really hard to own a car because, you know, to fix the car is this whole own thing. Often just to get petrol might be troublesome. Then all of this breaks down, and there we could have a whole long discussion about did it have to, could it have gone on, and so on. I'll jump over that. We don't need that at this point. But in Russia today, as we've seen with this frightening video earlier, where it said, "Be very afraid," there is quite some nostalgia for this empire. And part of the reason for this, I mean, there is the kind of just the nostalgia for we were somebody, everybody was afraid, and now nobody is anymore, although this seems to be changing slowly. But it's also that decolonization in a situation where you don't have a metropole, you know, the British Isles, and then an overseas empire, and you can chop off the overseas empire, you still have, you know, Great Britain or the United Kingdom. In Russia, this is much harder. Where is the border between Russia and the empire? Is Ukraine part of Russia or is it not? Where, you know, how far outside of Moscow can you go before you are no longer on Russian territory? So this idea that if you have an empire, it's actually easier to decolonize than if you are one from the beginning, when there is no national state you could retreat to. And other than feeling that you know, things have been chopped away from you. And that's the big challenge at the moment today in Russia really is to get over that hangover and this nostalgia for this empire, because, you know, it has been a quarter of a century now, right? So this is probably not going, well, who knows? I'm not going to predict anything. But that's the big problem for Russian, even a positive Russian nationalism is really hard to develop because there was never a Russian state which was not an empire. Thank you.
We have time for questions, about 10 minutes or so. So do we have any? We do.
Hi Mark, I was just wondering about sort of nationalist sentiment in the Soviet Union. The couple of books that I have read on Soviet history have dealt primarily with Stalin, Khrushchev, the Soviet Communist Party. I think of one of the examples that jumps to my head of Soviet nationalism being the sort of fight between the Hungarian and Soviet water polo team at the Melbourne Olympic Games. I'm just wondering how representative is that sort of event of the actual nationalist sentiment in the Soviet Union at that time?
Yeah. So, well, I think there's two things. So there's nationalism and patriotism, which is ethnic, if you like. So, you know, Russian nationalism, Ukrainian nationalism, Tajik nationalism. And then there is sort of Soviet patriotism, where you actually your adherence is to the Soviet Union and to the multinational but Soviet nation. And historians are conflicted about whether or not the latter existed. So there's always and whether the latter was, I mean, the Soviet patriotism was just a hidden way to say you're a Russian nationalist. I was quite convinced, actually, by a recent book, which is a history of Russia not becoming a nation, which is at the very beginning here of my various slides. Serhii Plokhy, Lost Kingdom, where he basically argues that by the 70s and 80s, among Slavic populations, so Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians in particular, you get more and more of that kind of a supranational Soviet patriotism. And he sees that, you know, there's more and more, there's a lot of mobility People live in other places of the Soviet Union. There's a lot of intermarriage. And all of this causes actually terrible problems after the breakdown, because you now have all of these expat nations. Are they part of the new, Estonian nation, or are they not? And what do you do with them? Do they have to be repatriated to Russia? Are they a fifth column of the Russians, and so on? So his sense was that among the core Slavic populations, you get, by the 70s or 80s, you get this kind of increasingly Soviet consciousness, which is, of course, sort of a little tragic, because then this all breaks apart and you have to then reinvent yourself as a Ukrainian or as a Russian. But that's not true for the populations in non-Russian borderlands, so beyond the Caucasus. So their national sentiment is always a problem which is potentially dissident. So, and you get that as well. I mean, among Ukrainians, certainly there's Ukrainian nationalists who are dissidents, and there's also Russian nationalists who are dissidents. But yeah, it's a huge field actually of debate.
Hi, Mark. I was just going to ask, what impact does the narrative of the World War II, with the Cold War, how the Russian-Soviet Union involvement was downplayed, and then with the 90s, many historians started to recognise the impact that the Soviets obviously had in the war, and now with the, the situation now that it's going back to a recognition of, I suppose it's Brexit too, but all the Churchill movies and all this. Yeah. I wonder if some of that stuff that you see, the nationalism, and that is an extreme response to that.
Well, World War II is, for current Russian national consciousness, World War II is absolutely central. This is the biggest achievement of the Soviet Union and therefore Russia, right? This is where we saved the world from fascism. We saved civilization. And this is, the funny thing is, as this is being aggressively sort of trotted out in Moscow, with a sort of real sense of grievance that Western historians have never dealt with this and have ignored it and so on. It's actually no longer true. There's one historian I know of, there's a recent book, who argues that the Soviets were not the ones winning the war in Europe, but it was really Bomber Command. It's a British historian, no, not surprisingly. But other than that, everybody pretty much says, yeah, it was the Soviets. There's then some quibbling about how important Lend-Lease was and so on. And of course, they did fight in a worldwide alliance with the biggest economy in the world, the United States, on their side. But it's actually no longer, this idea that nobody in the West paid attention to this is no longer true. But it's now become a conviction of very many Russian nationalists that the West doesn't care. And it's probably true in popular culture, right? Saving Private Ryan, right?
Games and
Yeah,
movies
yeah.
and focus on America, obviously.
Yeah. But that is very central. It's, of course, the war was not won by the Russians. It was won by the Red Army, which was multinational, and every nation in that state suffered terribly in this war. So the appropriation of this war only by the Russian nation is a little bit funny in many ways.
I was just wondering about, like in terms of the prehistory of all of these new states, in terms of a country like Poland, where you see the government now going very right-wing and in a sense rewriting this whole Soviet period and even harking back to the days of fascism. Just kind of wondering how that all pieces together. It's quite bizarre looking at it from the outside.
Well, the politics of history in the entire region are just horrible at the moment. It's wherever wherever you turn, something you say about the Second World War will be illegal. There's most successor states now have some sort of law which threatens you with prison if you say, in Poland, if you insult the Poles and say that there were Polish concentration camps, that's illegal. In Russia, if you somehow deny the victory of the Red Army or otherwise insult the Red Army, you might go to prison. In Ukraine, if you insult the OUN, the Ukrainian nationalist movement, and point out that they were that there was strong anti-Semitic elements among them, and that there was violence against Poles and against Jews among them, and not just national liberation movement, you might go to prison. So it's I mean, in terms of a dispassionate debate about the Second World War is not happening in Eastern Europe at the moment. It's still too raw, I think. It's still, although it's been a while now, but there's still people around who remember it, or who have a family history of it, and it has become very central to national consciousness pretty much everywhere. And I don't know where this will end. Yes, please.
You spoke about Stalin and how he said the Soviet Union had to catch up within 10 years.
Mm.
Now, would you say, yes, he did that at obviously at massive social cost? Did the ends justify the means, you think, in the end?
Well, it did in terms of military hardware and so on. They would probably have had a hard time fighting the Second World War without the industry they had, and I mean, more contentiously probably the dictatorship helped as well, because there was really nobody. I mean, there was no fifth column behind. I mean, people were disgruntled and so on, and didn't like where they lived. But at the same time, of course, whether or not you needed the Great Terror, for example, for this, whether or not you needed the kind of collectivization they ran through, whether or not this couldn't have been done in a somewhat more considered manner is a different question. But in terms of raw results, if that's what counts, they won the war. Right? I think we're out of time. Right? Thanks for coming.